In this module, we'll examine a collaborative effort and attempt to apply concepts from the lectures and readings to evaluate its effectiveness. Because collaboration doesn't prescribe a set list of prescriptions, each collaborative effort will be a unique response to the local conditions, so the environmental, economic, social, and cultural conditions. Not every problem is easily affected, and there will be no perfect collaborative effort. Each will face limitations and less than ideal conditions. That doesn't mean that collaboration is not an appropriate response. A less than ideal collaborative effort may still have superior results or added benefits, simultaneously addressing social issues, for example, compared to a top-down or single decision maker approach. That being said, collaboration is not always the best choice. We'll look at a real example of natural resource collaboration, and in discussion we'll apply the Indigenous stewardship model to the example as a means of evaluation. In Module 10, we define collaboration and we describe some attributes of collaborative efforts in general, including challenges and opportunities. Now let's examine a collaborative effort in a little more detail. As you read about this example, consider how some of the barriers to and benefits of collaboration apply in this specific situation. What questions might you ask, or what data might you collect to elicit more information that would allow you to evaluate the collaborative effort itself and how successful the collaboration has been? And what specifically would you evaluate? Would you evaluate the ability to affect on-the-ground management? Perhaps you'd evaluate equitable power sharing among members, or an increase in social capital experienced by members. Perhaps you might evaluate an increased understanding of the other's perspective. Consider also the elements of the Indigenous stewardship model described in Indigenous Peoples and the Collaborative Stewardship of Nature. Do they come into play in these examples? Which elements could be enhanced and how? What elements are successfully addressed by the group and how? The Alaska Beluga Whale Committee, hereafter referred to as ABWC, formed in 1988 to focus on managing the beluga whale populations off the west coast of Alaska. The goal of ABWC was to protect beluga whale populations and indigenous hunting rights. ABWC also conducts research to better understand the beluga whale populations, which will aid members in determining if harvest levels are appropriate. In 1977, the International Whaling Commission, IWC, placed a moratorium on bowhead whaling, and this greatly alarmed Alaskan and Yup'ik communities for whom bowhead whaling was an important economic activity. The indigenous whalers were given no warning of IWC's actions, and the first they learned that there was even concern about bowhead whale populations was when the ban was put into place. The indigenous communities were concerned that the population estimates that IWC used to justify the whaling ban were too low. The impacted communities created the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission to address the moratorium, and they were successful in negotiating a whaling quota in place of the ban and calling for more accurate population estimates. Improved population estimates that used more accurate measurement methods subsequently increased the hunters' quotas to be closer to their subsistence needs. Indigenous hunters of beluga whales observed with interest the actions of the IWC with regard to the bowhead whales and the response of the indigenous communities. Although beluga whales and whaling had not been threatened, indigenous hunters of beluga whales proactively formed the Alaska and Inuvialuit Beluga Whale Committee, now referred to as the Alaska Beluga Whale Commission, or ABWC. The committee was formed in 1988 to head off any such efforts to limit beluga whaling, so it was a very proactive approach. The mission of the ABWC was to gather information on numbers of beluga whales and population trends, and to collect evidence that demonstrated the skilled management of beluga whale populations by indigenous hunters. Their motive was to avoid outside regulation of indigenous whale hunting. The goals of ABWC are to co-manage the beluga whale. This is their primary goal. Indigenous hunters realized that outside agencies would be involved in beluga whale management. By forming a collaborative effort, The indigenous players assured that they would also be able to play an active role in that management effort. A second goal is to maintain healthy populations of belugas in Alaskan waters. Thirdly, to maintain adequate subsistence harvest of belugas. And finally, to protect the hunting privileges of Native Alaskan subsistence hunters. ABWC is engaged in monitoring the beluga whale population, as they understand that indigenous hunting rights will be threatened if the beluga whale population declines. Collecting data about the state of the natural resource that can be used to both inform management and also support user rights is a very common facet of many natural resource collaborative efforts. And you'll recall in the discussion on indigenous and science, indigenous knowledge and science, we discussed how many members of collaborative efforts are attempting to provide data that shows that their management is sustainable. Fernandez et al. In their 2006 article describe hunter attitudes to data collection by ABWC. Early in ABWC's history, hunters often feared that harvest data would be used against them. Rather than attempting to allay these fears, one agency scientist reported telling hunters, "Of course they're going to use it against you. You can never guarantee. But if it's your data, if it has your name on it as the source, and if it's as good as you can possibly make it, people are at least going to have to come to you and ask about it." The scientist went on to explain that it's an issue of control. If hunter data were not available, decision makers might use other data, potentially of questionable quality and validity, which hunters would be unable to contest. By this reasoning, it was better for the hunters to provide their own data, albeit scrutinized. The ABWC is composed of hunters from native villages, research scientists, and government representatives at the local, state, and national levels. In this case, the local level is the North Slope Borough Wildlife Department. The state level is Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And at the national level, we have the National Marine Fisheries Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. According to Fernandez and Menes et al., the integration of scientific, agency, and indigenous hunter perspectives in beluga whale management was facilitated by the organizational structure of ABWC that, quote, included a membership structure fostering genuine power sharing and a range of opportunities for formal and informal interactions among hunters and scientists, leading to long-term relationships and an organizational culture of open communication and transparency in decision-making. Informal socializing has allowed bonds to form between the different groups, and this has solidified their understanding of and respect for each other's perspectives. The ABWC has a formal annual meeting each year. The main activity at the annual meeting is the reports by hunter representatives from each community. These reports include the year's whale catch and characterize whale movements and hunting that year. Most of the speaking is done by indigenous people, although representatives from the scientific and government agencies also attend. Informal socializing also occurs during the whale hunt, at which time data is also collected for the research segment of ABWC. Indigenous hunters help with the data collection. They collect tissue samples of their catch to be included in studies that track the genetic makeup of the whales and their migratory paths. Scientists in turn help with the hunt, staying after their data has been collected to help butcher and distribute the whale meat amongst the local community. ABWC has an extensive array of outputs. In addition to the annual meetings, they have commented on a statewide management plan, they've created a co-management agreement, they've hosted science workshops, they've conducted research, they've engaged in education and outreach programs, and they've developed regional management plans. ABWC is conducting research on beluga whales, much of it focusing on beluga movements and population numbers. In a quote from Fernandez Jimenez in 2006, while reliable information about beluga whale populations does not necessarily ensure sound management or the conservation of beluga populations, We share the assumption that reliable and credible information on resource condition is a necessary foundation for successful management. ABWC has been involved in research of beluga migrations and whether different beluga populations interact with each other using satellite tagging and genetic studies. A lot of the data is collected during the hunt. For example, biological samples are collected from stricken whales by hunters before the whales are butchered, and this data is used in genetic studies to elicit whether the populations are separate stocks or whether they intermingle. Also during the hunt, once herded, some whales are tagged and released so their movements can be tracked by satellite to better understand migratory routes and timings. ABWC also undertakes studies that document the traditional ecological knowledge that hunters have of beluga whales. This knowledge is described as including the biophysical observations, skills and technologies, as well as the social and cultural values, norms, and institutions that guide human-environment interactions. The result of the studies and interpretations of the data aren't always embraced by the different groups equally. The timing of the aerial surveys hasn't always coincided with Indigenous recommendations of when a good time to survey is, and there is concern that the random sampling techniques used in the survey process have undersampled some areas, so there is some mistrust of the scientific process. While consensus has not been reached on interpretation, there is open dialogue surrounding the source of concern, with all members taking part. The table presented here comes from page 309 of Fernandez-Jimenez et al. 2006, and it depicts the different roles that scientists and hunters play in data collection, the contributions of traditional ecological knowledge, and the knowledge formed as a result of ABWC research activities. What do you notice about participation in the different ABWC activities? Do you feel the generation of scientific data by ABWC is truly collaborative in nature when you consider the different roles? Do power imbalances appear, or are these alleviated by the sharing of responsibility? One notable division within ABWC that Fernandez-Jimenez et al. Reported on was interpretations of tech and science by members of ABWC. All members showed close agreement on defining tech, or traditional ecological knowledge. However, there were differences in the perception of Western science. Scientists describe science as a process for uncovering certain types of knowledge. Indigenous participants agreed that was one role of science, but also felt that science was a power structure and it was intended to privilege certain groups above others. In 2003, I took part in a conference aimed at bringing together scientists and Native peoples to discuss how science could be made useful to Native communities. It was attended by scientists and Indigenous people alike, and many Indigenous scientists. And the participants focused on barriers to collaboration, opportunities for collaboration, and how science might be turned towards the service of Native communities. You might ask, why hadn't science been of service to Native communities already? And while surely in some instances it had, attempts to bring outside scientists to bear on issues facing Indigenous communities often resulted in hard feelings and a sense of loss of autonomy by the Indigenous population. On the third day of the conference, all of the participants sat down to describe what might be done to make scientific collaboration more successful in Native communities. Not surprisingly, many of the points listed dealt with social aspects of collaboration. So building trust, asking forgiveness, making time to build relationships, and discover common ground. In these next 3 slides, I'm including the list that was generated at the conference because many of these issues are salient still today. Collaborative efforts involve people first and foremost. People must be able to work together, to relate to each other, and to develop trust and come to an understanding before any collaborative effort will be able to achieve its goal, be that managing a natural resource or combating a health concern. Can you determine how many of these points are included in the ABWC? What might you ask or observe to learn more about ABWC and whether or not it's doing what is appropriate to develop and maintain trusting working relationships among its members. So here is the list. First on the list, trust. Get to know elders, medicine men, members of the community, participate in prayers, etc. And these were recommendations for the tribal members and also for the outsiders who were going to be collaborating with them. They wanted those outsiders, those scientists and government agents to participate in community activities. Give and ask forgiveness. Embrace spirituality if that helps, so you can move forward and create a new relationship, one that's not based solely on actions of the past. Create and maintain celebrations for the purpose of celebrating together. Remind each other that a debate or negotiation does not have to mean hatred. Diversify teaching and instruction. Keep it simple. Go back to values that are important to you. And the list continues. Start with one contact or entry to a community, but be aware that one person may not be the best contact. Change your mindset. Open your eyes, your heart, your ways of communication. Establish long-term relationships with the community. Give credit where it is due. Share ideas. Communicate. Give prior notice and explanation to communities before visiting. Allow plenty of time to discuss. One visit may not be enough. And remember to listen. Respect what is said. Be diplomatic and tactful, not angry. Involve the elders. Understand the person, his, her, their family, sense of place, intentions. Understand the context. Communities are overextended. Will research be one more effort? Can one fold research effort into current needs? Understand that in some cases, certain research topics are simply not acceptable. And finally, humility is very important. So that is the list that they came up with. And it might sound a little bit like something you might find on your kindergarten classroom wall. Respect each other, trust each other, be kind, be diplomatic. But collaboration is about social relationships. And that is much of what we learned about in kindergarten, how to form social relationships, how to be a member of a group. And those things are no less valid when you're working on a collaborative effort to come up with natural resource management. It still will help if people see each other as individuals and everyone is worthy of participating in the effort. So you can find many, many such lists of what is needed for successful collaboration. And this list comes from Wanda Lakanyafi, 2000 article, which is a critical article in the collaborative community. And they identified several keys to successful collaboration. So note that Wanda Lakanyafi were not focused specifically on collaboration between indigenous communities and scientists, but collaboration in general. Still, the keys they list are appropriate for collaborative efforts, no matter whom they involve. Since natural resource collaboration is just as much about user groups working together collectively as it is about applying appropriate natural resource management techniques, many of the keys involve building social relationships between the different user groups, building common ground, interacting with the other members of the collaborative effort, fostering responsibility and commitment, building relationships, and giving and getting help, all focus on building and sustaining meaningful and respectful relationships among members. The last three items in this speak to the need to be creative and accommodating in the collaborative process. There is no one prescription for what successful collaboration looks like. Collaborative efforts must conform to the various constraints they encounter, be those social, cultural, economic, or ecological in nature. Dr. Fernandez Jimenez, a researcher in the Forest Rangeland Stewardship Department at CSU, applied Wanda Lakanyafi's tips for successful collaboration to the ABWC to more fully understand if and how ABWC was participating in activities thought to enhance collaboration. Her summary is included in the table here. It's worth noting that people do not tend to be proactive, and most collaborative groups form once a problem is already realized, not in advance of a potential problem like ABWC did. So ABWC is very unusual in this regard. Again, ABWC was formed in response to the ban on bowhead whaling that occurred in the 1970s. It formed to address beluga whaling, which hadn't been threatened prior to ABWC's formation. So some of the ways she found that they were conforming to Wunderlich and Yaffe's suggestion were that they developed a mission statement. So this reflected the common ground they had built. ABWC itself represented new interactions, and the co-management agreement formalized these. The process was marked by listening, respect. New members were socialized by old members. There was a balanced power structure and strong relationships that formed among the different groups. And we saw that in the scientists who helped participate in the hunt and the hunters that helped participate in the science and data collection. The research and combining the research and the traditional ecological knowledge in the research is an example of the group practicing new approaches to the problem. And the long-standing members were very committed, always looking forward to and attending the annual meetings, for example. There were many opportunities to build relationships, and these relationships were built. So at the annual meetings, at the banquet and the awards, and during the joint research/hunting that occurred throughout the year. The group, again, was unusual in that it was very proactive, so they formed in absence of a beluga whale population crisis. And they did practice opportunities to both give and receive help from each other. So they got federal line item they got federal line item funding. They were able to provide grants and technical support as a result. Dr. Fernandez-Jimenez also examined some pros and cons of the ABWC collaborative effort. She considered, for example, the resource characteristics and some of the pros and cons of the resource characteristics relative to ABWC and to collaboration in general. In this case, the resource is the beluga whales. And the beluga whale population is healthy, which makes collaborative management quite a bit easier. There's not a crisis that requires immediate action. From a collaborative standpoint, this is good, as collaboration is time-consuming, and a lot of time is required up front in developing trust and common ground amongst the group. And it can be very difficult to conceive of a plan of action quickly that everyone agrees on, particularly before you've had time to build that trust and common ground. The con with managing whales collaboratively is that they're mobile and unpredictable. The management that one community adopts will affect the whale population, but so will the management they experience on their migration through other communities, and the changing state of the ocean conditions will also affect them. So it's difficult to know if the collaborative management efforts are being effective or not. Some group characteristics that of the ABWC were found to both have pros and cons. As a group, the ABWC functions well because it's composed of small communities that have many shared norms. The community groups involved pose a challenge in that leadership is low and poverty is high in these communities. So as a result, people may not always be able to devote the time required, and they may not have the resources needed to effect a change. Looking at the resource group relationships, Maria found, or Dr. Fernandez-Jimenez, found pros in that the people in the resource are generally, the relationship between the people in the resource is very conducive to collaborative management because the users live near and are culturally tied to the resource. So they're very, very invested in the resource. Additionally, the benefits are shared amongst the entire community fairly. So in co-managing this resource, they are not creating schisms in the local community. Finally, the communities also have a clear right to use and manage the whales, and there is low demand for whales, so there's not a lot of competition for this resource. The rules generated by the ABWC are simple, easy to understand, and they're created locally, and this makes them easier to follow and more likely that they will be followed. However, it should also be noted that it is difficult to monitor and enforce the rules, and therefore accountability is sometimes weak. The ABWC has been reluctant to write down a formal set of rules. They're more comfortable with unwritten rules, so norms of behaviors, that can change to adapt to the current situation. The norms are enforced through social means. So a hunter who takes more whales than is socially acceptable might get a talking down to from an elder, or they may be scolded publicly. These are traditional and very compelling forms of social compliance in Indigenous communities.